In 1986, a school bus of 15 children vanished into the Oregon woods without a sound. 39 years later, it's unearthed, buried, sealed tight, and empty. The forest knows what happened, but it isn't talking. Some mysteries never fade with time. They linger like fog in the pine-covered hills, threading themselves into the cracks of small-town memory. They don't just get older. They get heavier. They stain generations, turn landmarks into haunted symbols, and twist innocent places into grim reminders of what was lost. In the remote logging town of Shasta Grove, Oregon, one question has hung in the mountain air for nearly 4 decades. Whispered at family gatherings, muttered in hushed tones at the diner, passed like a curse from parent to child. What happened to Bus 54? On October 17, 1986, 15 children and their school bus driver disappeared during what should have been a routine field trip. The Pine Barrens Environmental Center lay only 42 miles away from Shasta Grove Elementary. The bus departed the school grounds at 8:03 a.m. Right on time, Mrs. Elaine Mercer had packed peanut butter sandwiches for her third graders. A few of the kids wore their favorite tree identification badges. The driver, Henry Garrison, a widower, known for letting kids honk the horn after school, gave the principal a thumbs up as he pulled out. There was no reason to think anything was wrong, but the bus never arrived at the Pine Barrens facility. No frantic call came in from the road. No flat tire, no accident, no delay. By 9:30 a.m., the school secretary had called the ranger station to ask if Bus 54 had perhaps taken a longer route. At 10:12, the school administrator called the sheriff's office. By noon, search teams were rolling out into the surrounding wilderness. At 3 p.m., the Oregon State Police declared an official missing persons investigation. By sundown, it was clear. The bus, the children, and their driver had vanished completely. No tire tracks, no wreckage, no screams heard. The forest had simply swallowed them whole. The weight of that day never left Shasta Grove, the logging town, nestled between steep ridgelines and silent pines, had never known much more than bad weather and the occasional hunting accident. But after that Friday morning, it became something else entirely, a place frozen in grief. Parents who had hugged their kids goodbye that morning watched the sun go down with no answers. Teachers were questioned like suspects. Classrooms sat empty. 15 desks remained untouched for weeks before anyone had the courage to clear them. Locals stopped calling it a disappearance. They called it the vanishing. It didn't just change the community, it defined it. Residents put up their Halloween decorations that year, but not a single child went trick-or-treating. Christmas came and went in near silence. The 4th of July parade in 1987 was canceled out of respect. And slowly, the families either left town, drank themselves quiet, or became permanent fixtures at town hall meetings, forever demanding answers from officials who no longer had anything to give. Over the years, theories multiplied like weeds. A cult, a military experiment, a freak sinkhole. Some said the driver snapped. Others blamed wildlife. A few whispered about lights in the forest stories that went back generations. But every story came with the same ending. There was no trace. Not of the bus, not of the kids, not of Henry Garrison. It was as if the road had unspooled beneath their tires and swallowed them whole. For nearly 40 years, the people of Shasta Grove lived with that silence. Every fall, when the leaves turned gold and the wind picked up through the trees, old wounds reopened. The bus never came home. The laughter of 15 children never returned to the schoolyard. And deep in the forest, something remained buried, not just the truth, but a question no one could ever stop asking. How can something so big just vanish? Then, in the summer of 2025, an excavation crew breaking ground on the northern edge of the Pine Barrens hit something metallic. At first, they thought it was a septic tank, maybe an old trailer. But when the topsoil was cleared, and the sun hit the faded yellow paint, someone gasped. Sticking out from the dirt was the unmistakable curve of a school bus roof. Bus 54 had been found. But what it revealed would shake the town all over again. Because the bus was not wrecked, it was buried. Deliberately, sealed, hidden, and it wasn't empty. October 17, 1986, began like any other crisp fall morning in Shasta Grove, Oregon. The town, tucked between endless rows of Douglas firs and damp canyon roads, was just waking up under a canopy of low gray clouds and the first hints of morning. Sun bleeding through, wood smoke curled lazily from chimneys. The logging trucks rumbled along Main Street, tailed by pickup trucks and station wagons filled with sleepy-eyed children. At Shasta Grove Elementary, the playground rang with the sound of laughter, sneakers on pavement, and the high-pitched squeals of excitement that only a field trip could conjure. Inside room 2B, Mrs. Elaine Mercer had her class lined up single file by 7:52 a.m., each student carrying a brown paper lunch, a sweater, and their signed permission slip tucked into their coat pocket. It was a third-grade tradition. Every fall, her class visited the Pine Barrens Environmental Center, a patch of state-protected wilderness where children learned about owl pellets, native plant species, and how to track deer prints in the mud. Mercer, a lifelong teacher with 30 years under her belt and a collection of owl brooches pinned to her cardigan, was the kind of educator students remembered decades later. Organized kind, firm when she needed to be, she loved the Pine Barrens. Trip, so did the kids. The morning air was cool and sharp with the smell of damp leaves. Yellow and red foliage carpeted the ground, and frost still clung to the shaded patches of grass. The children climbed aboard bus number 54 just before 8 a.m., chattering and laughing, their voices echoing down the asphalt. Henry Garrison, the longtime school bus driver, sat behind the wheel with his usual coffee thermos and a quiet smile. He greeted each child by name as they passed. His clipboard rested on the dashboard, neatly checked. 15 students, 1 teacher, 1 driver. All accounted for. Parents stood along the curb waving, some snapping Polaroids, others watching with crossed arms and tight-lipped smiles. For them, it was another school day, another milestone. No one knew it would be the last photograph they'd ever have of their child. At precisely 8:03 a.m., bus number 54 pulled away from the school parking lot, its engine humming steadily, a trail of exhaust rising into the pale autumn sky. It turned onto Highway 12, then disappeared down the winding stretch that led toward the Pine Barrens. The bus was expected to arrive by 9:15 a.m. A ranger had been assigned to lead the tour. Lunches were to be eaten by the old fire tower at noon. They were scheduled to return by 2:30. Everything was planned. But sometime between the school and the Pine Barrens turnoff, bus number 54 vanished. No distress call came over the radio. No emergency stop. No report of mechanical issues. The Pine Barrens staff waited, then called the school. The school called the highway patrol. When noon passed with no word, panic began to form around the edges of protocol. Back in room 2B, Mrs. Mercer's empty classroom remained untouched. On her desk sat a stack of science worksheets she had planned to hand out the next Monday. On the chalkboard, in her careful cursive, the day's learning objectives still read, "Today we observe the forest and its hidden stories." No one could have known just how haunting that sentence would become. In the early afternoon, when the first patrol car reported no sign of the bus along the known route, people began to whisper. When helicopter sweeps turned up nothing but trees and fog, those whispers turned to dread. Bus number 54, with its 15 children and 1 devoted driver, had left the schoolyard behind and simply disappeared into the woods. The day that had begun with laughter and lunch bags would become a date carved into stone, one the town of Shasta Grove would never forget. The last time anyone heard from bus number 54 was at 8:36 a.m. Henry Garrison's voice crackled through the school's two-way radio system, calm and clipped. "Turning onto Forest Route 19 now. Everything looks good." It was the final confirmation. From the road, a routine check-in made at the halfway point between Shasta Grove Elementary and the Pine Barrens Environmental Center. The school secretary, Clara Hayes, jotted the time into her logbook without thinking twice. Nothing in Garrison's voice suggested worry or urgency. Nothing in the weather or traffic reports hinted at trouble. Everything was on schedule. At 9:15. The Pine Barrens staff began glancing at their watches. The center sat near the southern edge of the National Forest, a quiet compound of ranger buildings and trailheads where school groups came and went like clockwork. Field trips rarely arrived more than a few minutes off schedule. They were expecting 15 third graders and 2 adults. Ranger Michael Dwyer, assigned to lead the tour, paced outside with a clipboard, scanning the narrow road that curved up. Into the trees, no bus, no sound. Just the wind stirring through the pines. By 9:30, the center's receptionist, Janine Callow, phoned the school. A polite inquiry at first. Perhaps the group left late? Maybe traffic? Hayes double-checked the log. No record of a delay. Garrison's 8:36 check-in was still the last communication. She assured Callow that the bus should be arriving shortly. Still no cause for concern. At 9:50, the staff at Pine Barrens walked the perimeter road to make sure the bus hadn't parked in an alternate lot. They checked the maintenance garage and even the nearby picnic area. Nothing. Just empty gravel and a growing sense of unease. At 10:12, Principal Evan Merrick placed a direct call to the Benton County Sheriff's Office. It wasn't a report, not yet. Just a heads up. He explained that a school bus with 15 children and 1 driver was over 45 minutes late arriving at its field trip destination and hadn't checked in. Dispatcher Judy Ralston took the information, voice neutral but alert. She told Merrick she would relay the message to highway patrol units in the area. Merrick thanked her, then stood by the window of his office, watching as clouds gathered above the redwood-studded hills beyond the football field. By 10:30, all scheduled calls from the bus had been missed. The school attempted to reach Garrison by radio 3 separate times. No answer, only static. On the 3rd attempt, Hayes looked up at the principal with a pale, stricken face. "Something's wrong," she said. At 11 o'clock, 2 patrol units were dispatched to scan the route between the school and the Pine Barrens. The trip in total was only about 42 miles. It should have taken no more than an hour and 10 minutes. If there had been an accident, someone would have seen something. If there had been a breakdown, Garrison would have radioed in. But the road was clear. The route was empty. At 11:45, the principal contacted the parents. Carefully, cautiously, he said there had been a delay, that they were working with authorities to locate the group, that no one should panic. But the moment the first parent heard the words, "no contact," panic began to flicker under the surface. By 12:30 p.m., the bus was officially declared missing. Time for the people of Shasta Grove stopped moving forward that day. The hands of the clock no longer pointed to lunch breaks or recess bells. Instead, they looped endlessly back to that moment, 8:36 a.m., the last breath of normalcy, the last sign of safety. A school bus full of laughter had rolled into the woods and vanished. By early afternoon on October 17, 1986, Shasta Grove was no longer just a quiet logging town tucked between the pines. It was the epicenter of a growing emergency. The missing bus wasn't just a school transportation issue anymore. It was a crisis, a riddle wrapped in bark and shadow. When word spread that bus number 54, carrying 15 children and 1 adult, had failed to arrive and couldn't be reached by radio, a sense of dread descended over the community like a low, suffocating fog. At 1 p.m., the Benton County Sheriff's Department mobilized their first formal search units. Aerial support was called in from the state. The Oregon State Police dispatched helicopters equipped with infrared imaging, sweeping the long winding roads that cut through the Pine Barrens wilderness. From above, the world looked like a sea of treetops, dense and unbroken. The helicopters saw nothing, no fresh clearings, no overturned vehicle, no movement beneath the canopy. Just forest miles and miles of indifferent, ancient forest. On the ground, patrol cars traced the route between the school and the environmental center again and again. Officers pulled over to inspect every turnout, every trailhead, every service road that spurred off the main highway. They searched creek beds, ravines, and ditches. They talked to every gas station attendant and delivery driver along Route 12. No one had seen the bus. Not once, not anywhere. By 3 p.m., volunteers had begun showing up at the sheriff's substation and the school gymnasium. Mothers arrived with tears still fresh on their cheeks. Fathers showed up in work boots and hunting gear. Teenagers skipped classes and brought flashlights. Teachers came straight from their classrooms, their arms crossed tight to hold something. Within an hour, hundreds had assembled, forming search parties to be dispatched into the woods. Search dogs were brought in from nearby counties. They were given articles of clothing, sweatshirts, hats, scarves, and sent off into the underbrush near Forest Route 19. The dogs wandered, sniffed, circled back, and lay down. Nothing, no scent trail, no direction to follow. That night, the governor's office authorized emergency aid to expand the search perimeter. Rangers from the Department of Forestry joined the effort, along with trained wilderness rescuers and volunteer SAR teams from all over Oregon. The search zone was expanded in concentric circles, up logging roads, around reservoirs, through thickets of blackberry and alder. Radios crackled with coordinates and check-ins, but no one reported a sighting. No one found broken branches, skid marks, shattered glass, no bent guardrails, no tire grooves in the mud. By sunset, the town had reached an emotional boiling point. Families paced outside their homes with transistor radios pressed to their ears. The mayor issued a statement asking for calm, for faith in the process, but even his voice shook. In a town where everyone knew everyone, 15 missing children wasn't just a tragedy. It was an amputation. As night fell, the lights from the quay search teams blinked like fireflies against the forest gloom. Generators hummed at the temporary command post erected outside the Pine Barrens trail entrance. Hot coffee was passed in thermoses from one shivering volunteer to the next. No one wanted to go home. No one could sleep, not while the children were still out there. By midnight, not a single clue had been found. Not a single sign that bus number 54 had ever traveled that road. It was as if the bus and everything inside it had simply vanished into the trees. By the second day, Shasta Grove no longer felt like a town. It felt like a wound. A quiet, sprawling grief had settled over the community like ash after a fire, thick, suffocating, and inescapable. The rhythm of daily life, once tied to school. Bells and shift whistles ground to a halt. The paper mill paused its operations. Local businesses closed their doors without being asked. Teachers stopped showing up to teach. And no one could remember the last time the church bells hadn't rung on a Sunday. But on October 19th, they didn't. Instead, the doors of every church in town remained open around the clock, candles flickering in their entryways. Pews filled with families who hadn't gone home in days. Parents wandered the sidewalks like ghosts, some clutching flyers bearing their child's face, others holding onto coffee cups that had long since gone cold. They moved in slow, broken steps, like people walking through a bad dream they couldn't wake from. Some refused to speak. Others asked the same questions over and over. Have they found the bus yet? Did you hear anything new? Did someone take them? The answers were always the same. Nothing. No, we don't know. Mrs. Diane Ruggles, whose daughter Abigail had been seated in the second row of the bus that morning, stood in her front yard for nearly 3 hours each afternoon, waiting for the sound of tires on gravel. When neighbors gently urged her inside, she shook her head and said, "She come back hungry." She left the porch light on every night. She wasn't the only one. By the end of the week, every porch in town glowed long after midnight. 100 tiny beacons straining into the dark. The school board suspended classes indefinitely, not because they had to, but because no one could fathom sending children back into those empty hallways. The third-grade classrooms in particular remained untouched. Lunchboxes still sat inside cubbies. Art projects decorated the bulletin boards. One teacher, Mrs. Foley, refused to erase the chalkboard. On it were the names of all 15 missing children, circled in red, as if calling attendance might summon them back. Candlelight vigils became nightly rituals. Entire streets glowed with flickering white. Families gathered shoulder to shoulder, bundled in blankets, hands clasped, singing lullabies and hymns through choked voices. Local clergy took turns speaking, but it was often the silence between prayers that spoke the loudest. The kind of silence that made the back of your neck feel cold. Rumors grew like weeds in the stillness. Some whispered about a cult or an escaped convict in the woods. Others blamed the government, the school district, even the environmental center. But beneath the speculation was something deeper and more frightening, an unspoken fear that the woods had taken the children, and the woods were not going to give them back. In homes across Shasta Grove, parents left bedroom doors cracked open. They set places at the table. They folded laundry for children who had not come home in days. Hope became a ritual, practiced with clenched fists and red eyes. But behind every act of faith was the weight of something too terrible to say aloud, the creeping possibility that their children might never return. And through it all, the forest stood quiet and still, just beyond the edge of town, as if it were watching. Before the mystery consumed the headlines, before theories took root and paranoia colored every conversation in Shasta Grove, Henry Garrison was just the bus driver. Reliable, unshakable, and quietly adored. He had driven bus number 54 for nearly 17 years, navigating the narrow, winding backroads of rural Oregon with the same patient ease that he brought to every conversation. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. But to the students, Henry was as much a fixture of school life as recess or chocolate milk in the cafeteria. He was 61 years old when he vanished along with his passengers. A Korean War veteran with a head of silver hair, thick eyebrows, and a weathered face softened by a gentle smile. He lived alone in a modest cabin just outside of town, surrounded by pine trees and stacks of split firewood. A widower for almost a decade, Henry never remarried after his wife Carol died of pancreatic cancer. He had no children of his own, but treated every kid who boarded his bus like they were family. He knew them by name. He knew which ones liked to sit by the window, and which ones got carsick. On cold mornings, he'd keep a wool blanket folded across the back seat in case someone forgot theirs. He kept his clipboard tucked under his arm and his uniform clean. The dashboard of bus number 54 was always immaculate, no gum wrappers, no dust. He cleaned it every Friday. Maintenance reports were always turned in on time. Teachers joked that if you wanted to know the real weather forecast, ask Henry, not the radio. He had a sixth sense for black ice, dead batteries, and broken branches across the road. When news of the disappearance broke, no one in Shasta Grove suspected Henry of wrongdoing. Not at first. He was too kind, too responsible. But as the hours stretched into days and the bus remained missing, the search for explanations grew desperate. Investigators were forced to consider every possibility. Had Henry suffered a medical episode, heart attack, stroke, even a dizzy spell, that caused him to veer off the road unnoticed? But the roads were clear. There were no skid marks, signs of a crash or a sudden stop. Had someone forced him off the road? Hijacked the bus? If so, there was no witness, no struggle, no transmission of distress. It didn't add up. Then came the question no one wanted to ask. Had Henry taken the children, voluntarily? The idea made people uncomfortable. It felt like a betrayal of the town's trust, even to suggest it. But detectives had to look at it. They pulled his employment records, military history, financials. There was nothing alarming. No debt, no criminal history, no complaints filed. Just a paper trail of quiet decency. His cabin was searched thoroughly. Inside they found framed pictures of his wife, a drawer of postcards from old army buddies, a dozen books on Pacific Northwest flora, and a shoebox full of Valentine cards made by students over the years. There were no maps, no survival guides, no signs of planning. Nothing to suggest escape. As the case grew colder, Henry's image began to warp in the public imagination. For some, he remained the faithful driver, perhaps the victim of foul play. Himself. For others, the not knowing was too unbearable, and they began to see guilt in his silence, malice in the void he left behind. But truth never arrived to fill that void. No one saw him after 8:36 a.m. that morning. Not a hiker, not a ranger, not a hunter. He disappeared along with the children, leaving behind only his reputation and a town that couldn't decide whether to remember him with reverence or suspicion. In the weeks following the disappearance, the hope of finding the children alive had not yet been extinguished, but it had begun to flicker, unreliable and easily shaken. What kept it going were the reports, dozens at first, then hundreds. A tidal wave of calls, tips, and whispers that poured in from across Oregon and beyond. Everyone seemed to know something. Everyone had seen something. And no one, it turned out, was right. The first call came from a trucker in northern Idaho, 3 days after bus number 54 vanished. He claimed to have seen an old yellow school bus parked behind a shuttered gas station near Coeur d'Alene, well off the main highway. It was partially obscured by pine trees and looked, he said, out of place. When asked if there were children, he hesitated. "I thought I saw a little head in the back window. Could have been imagination or a doll." State police followed. Up immediately. The gas station had been abandoned for years. There was no bus, no tire tracks, no dolls. Then came the Montana sighting. This one from a woman who swore she'd seen a school bus with Oregon plates pull into a truck stop outside Missoula. She even wrote down part of the plate number, which turned out to belong to a delivery van registered in Eugene. Investigators reviewed security footage. There was no bus, no children, just another dead end. Psychics began calling the sheriff's department by the end of the first week. Some offered their services for free. Others demanded money or national exposure. They spoke of underground tunnels, caves beneath the forest, rivers hiding metal beasts. One woman insisted she had a vision of the children standing in a circle around a fire in a place where the trees whisper backward. Another sent a cassette tape filled with distorted recordings of her own dreams, set to ominous piano music. Authorities listened to everyone, not because they believed, but because desperation leaves no room for arrogance. Then came the letters. Some typed, others scrawled in messy handwriting. Most were hoaxes, plain and cruel. One claimed to be from one of the children, now grown, writing from Canada and unable to remember their real name. Another, more disturbing, included a crude drawing of a school bus on fire and the words, "They are gone, and it's your fault." That envelope contained traces of red powder, later confirmed to be paprika. A prank, someone's sick idea of participation. But each letter had to be logged, analyzed, and considered. Time was wasted. Energy was drained. The sheriff's office began to fray under the weight of false hope. Detectives, already working 14-hour days, found themselves chasing ghosts. Through forests and gas stations hundreds of miles from the original search site. Each new lead pulled resources away from real investigation. Each dead end took a piece of the town's resolve with it. Worse still, the endless trickle of false sightings began to chip away at something more fragile than manpower: belief. Parents who had clung to every update now stopped answering the phone after dark. Neighbors stopped bringing casseroles and started keeping their distance. Conversations grew shorter. Eyes grew duller. Every time a new report came in, it was harder to believe. Harder to get back up when it failed. Hope didn't shatter in a single moment. It bled out slowly, diluted by misdirection and the cruelty of a world that kept teasing answers and then ripping them away. And through it all, bus number 54 remained. Missing, 15 children, one driver, no footprints, no wreckage. Just silence and a trail of false leads that stretched out across the Pacific Northwest, like a cruel joke with no punchline. Over time, when facts remain few and answers refuse to come, stories take their place. In Shasta Grove, the story of bus number 54 didn't just linger, it transformed. What began as a tragedy became a legend, then something older, stranger, and harder to hold. People stopped talking about the search in past tense. Instead, they spoke of the lost bus like it was a living thing, cursed or hidden by forces just beyond comprehension. The Pine Barrens became less a place of learning and more a landscape of whispers, a forest shrouded in something ancient and unresolved. By the early 90s, the official investigation had long gone cold, but the mystery had only grown warmer. In the mouths of locals, teenagers passed down stories in locker rooms and sleepovers, repeating details that had never been part of the original case: that the bus drove itself into the trees, that no one was behind the wheel, that it still roamed the back roads at night, looking for lost children to replace the ones it had taken. Some said the children were taken underground by a cult that worshipped the forest. Others swore there were tunnels beneath the Pine Barrens, carved out by the government during the Cold War, where the kids had been hidden away as part of an experiment gone wrong. Urban explorers from Portland and Eugene began making pilgrimages to Shasta Grove. They came with cameras, flashlights, and printed maps dotted with old ranger trails and decommissioned service roads. Most left with nothing but blisters and disappointment. A few claimed they heard strange sounds, metal groaning in the wind, children's laughter echoing through the trees, the low hum of an idling engine deep in the woods. One group swore they found tire tracks that ended in the middle of nowhere. The photos they took were blurry and inconclusive, but they circulated online under headlines like, "Where did Bus 54 go?" and "Oregon's Silent Mass Abduction." The internet gave the legend a second life. Children born years after the disappearance grew up knowing the story before they could even spell. Shasta Grove. They dared each other to hike into the Pine Barrens after dark, to leave candy behind for the lost kids, or knock 3 times on the forest floor and listen for a horn in return. Some claimed to have done it. Some said they saw eyes in the trees. Most were lying, but lying didn't matter. The story didn't need to be true anymore. It had outgrown the facts. The town itself wore the weight of the legend like a scar that never healed clean. Outsiders came to gape. Journalists returned every few years for updates that never materialized. Shasta Grove became synonymous with sorrow, a name whispered alongside Roswell and Point Pleasant, but with something quieter, more aching at its core. 15 missing children, one driver. No resolution. Even the physical reminders became part of the myth. The old pine near the elementary school, where the kids waited for the bus each morning, was now called the Last Stop Tree. Some locals claimed the bark still bore the fingernail scratches of frightened hands. In truth, it was just weathered wood, but truth had long stopped mattering in Shasta Grove. Every autumn, as the leaves turned gold and the air sharpened, the town braced itself. Reporters would call again. Strangers would show up with equipment and theories. Residents would draw their curtains a little tighter, speak a little softer, and wait for it all to pass. But the legend never left. It camped out at the edge of the forest, always watching, always waiting. In Shasta Grove, people didn't talk about if anymore. They talked about when. When the truth would come out, when the bus would be found, when the forest would finally give back what it had taken. Until then, they lived with the silence and the stories that tried to fill it. By the spring of 1994, nearly 8 years after the disappearance of bus number 54, the search had long since stopped. The command tents had been folded and carted away, the maps rolled up and boxed, the volunteers thanked and dismissed. The once relentless media attention had faded into the background noise of new scandals and fresher tragedies. Shasta Grove tried to move on, or at least learn how to function under the weight of what had never been answered. But behind the scenes, in the dusty backroom of the Benton County Sheriff's Office, the case still lived filed away in metal drawers, its edges yellowing with time. Sheriff Dan Merton wasn't from Shasta Grove originally. He had spent most of his career in Tillamook, a coastal town with its own share of hardship, though nothing like what he inherited when he accepted the top job in Benton County. The outgoing sheriff, Howard Mays, had lasted over 3 decades, and left Merton with a word of caution and a stack of unsolved case files he referred to, grimly, as the cemetery. Among them was the thick, dog-eared binder marked simply, Bus 54, October 1986. For weeks, Merton let the file sit untouched on the corner of his desk. He told himself he was too busy adjusting to the new office, too consumed by the mundane duties of small-town law enforcement, barn fires, lost hikers, family disputes. But really, he wasn't sure he wanted to open it. He'd read about the case back when it happened. Everyone in Oregon had. But reading about it was different from holding it in your hands, from feeling its weight. 15 children, 1 adult, and 8 years of silence. Eventually, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when the station was quiet and the phone hadn't rung in hours, he pulled the file closer. He flipped through faded reports, interview transcripts, search maps stained with coffee, and typewritten timelines annotated in 3 different handwritings. He spent nearly an hour studying every piece of paper, waiting for something to jump out. Nothing did. It all felt just as impossible as it had back then. But just as he was ready to set the file aside again, he noticed something odd. A manila envelope tucked near the back, misfiled behind a set of press clippings. It was labeled NV Center Sup Photos in ballpoint pen, barely legible. He opened it carefully. Inside were 6 glossy photographs, curled slightly at the corners. The first few showed the usual things, images taken by a ranger named Claire Nystrom during her regular rounds the morning of October 17, 1986. Pictures of the trailheads, the visitor center, a footbridge over the creek. But the last photo was different. It had been taken from a ridge about 2 miles east of the environmental center. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable, just trees and shadow and distant brush. But Merton squinted and leaned closer. Near the bottom right of the frame, partially hidden by the slope of the land and the angle of the trees, was a shape. Yellow, curved, not a full vehicle, not clearly, but enough to raise the hairs on the back of his neck. The coloring wasn't natural. It didn't belong. And it matched, unmistakably, the faded yellow of a standard-issue school bus. The time stamp on the photo was 8:42, AIM 6, minutes after Henry Garrison's final radio transmission. No one had ever logged this photo in the official chain of evidence. It had been tucked away, likely glanced over in haste, never properly cataloged, never analyzed. Merton held it in his hand and felt the weight of 8 years pressed down on him. The forest might have swallowed bus number 54, but something had left a glimpse behind. Sheriff Dan Merton stared at the photograph under the harsh light of his desk lamp, his thumb pressed just beneath the blurred yellow curve, tucked in the bottom right of the frame. He'd turned the image sideways, then upside down, hoping a new angle might offer clarity. It didn't. But what it did offer, what it refused to let go of, was the possibility. Possibility that the bus hadn't vanished into thin air, hadn't been abducted by some incomprehensible force, but had instead been moved, deliberately and carefully, just out of view. The photo had been taken at 8:42 a.m. on the day of the disappearance by Claire Nystrom, a forest ranger assigned to patrol the east perimeter of the Pine Barrens. Her log for that morning was uneventful, clear trails, no incidents, weather mild. The photos had been taken as part of a routine inspection for trail maintenance funding, the kind of bureaucratic detail no one would have looked at twice during the initial chaos of the missing bus. And they hadn't, until now, the blur soft-edged and sun-dappled sat along a sloped ridgeline that wasn't visible from the main access road. It could have been a trick of the light, a patch of golden leaves, or even a large piece of construction equipment left behind by forestry crews. But Merton knew buses. He'd seen too many in his life to mistake the curvature of that roofline, the symmetry of its length, even in half-profile. It wasn't a rock formation or a cluster of fall foliage. It was something man-made, painted yellow. And out-of-place dot, he brought the photo to the evidence room, scanning and enlarging it, isolating pixels until the shape lost its realism and became a collection of distorted color. But the more he studied it, the more convinced he became. The angle of the blur matched the slope of the ridge almost too well, as if whatever it was had been positioned to blend in. He couldn't prove it yet, but something inside him whispered what logic tried to deny. The bus had been moved off-road, hidden from both the air and ground searches, and left to sit in silence. Merton drove out to the Pine Barrens the next morning, photo in hand, accompanied by Deputy Cal Ramirez. They followed the rough trail that paralleled the ridge, then hiked by foot through underbrush and ankle-deep moss. The terrain was steep in places, dotted with old stumps and thick bramble. A person on foot could get through with effort. A bus? That was harder to imagine unless it had been driven off-road early, before the ground had hardened for the season, and with help, they found nothing definitive. No tire tracks remained after 8 years. No gouges in the trees, no broken branches. Still dangling. But near the coordinates where the photo had been taken, they found something else. Silence. A stillness in the air, unnatural and heavy, as if the forest had been holding its breath for too long. When Merton returned to his office, he reopened the original case file with renewed urgency. The theory forming in his mind was unsettling, but it explained too many details that had never made sense. What if the bus hadn't crashed or broken down or been hijacked along the highway? What if it had exited the main road well before anyone thought to look? What if it had been deliberately hidden, taken somewhere just beyond the line of sight, placed in a pocket of the woods no helicopter or hiker would have stumbled across? The photo was blurry. It didn't prove anything, but it reopened the wound. And more than that, it reopened the hunt. On the morning of May 6, 2025, just outside the eastern boundary of the Pine Barrens, a construction crew working on the Ridgeview Estates housing development hit metal. The job had started like any other tree clearing, leveling earth, preparing to pour foundations on a stretch of land long believed to be untouched aside from old logging trails. The excavator operator, a man named Jake Merrill, was guiding his bucket through a section of dense clay-packed soil when he heard it, a hollow, unmistakable clang. He stopped immediately, thinking at first it might be an old septic tank or an oil drum left behind by a logger decades ago. It wasn't unusual for backcountry lots to hide buried junk, especially this close to abandoned timberland. But as they cleared away more earth, the metal object began to take shape, flat, curved, and longer than expected. It wasn't a barrel. It wasn't a tank. It was something larger. 5 feet down, beneath decades of roots and compressed earth, the top of a roof began to emerge. Yellow paint, faded but still vivid beneath the layers of mud, caught the sunlight. That was the moment. Everything stopped. Merrill climbed down from the excavator, walked over in silence, and stared at what was now clearly a vehicle, a roof hatch. A domed top, a seam running down the center. And there, partially obscured by grime, the flaking outline of white letters. District 9. A school bus. The crew marked off the site immediately and notified local authorities. Within the hour, Benton County deputies had arrived, followed by Sheriff's Office crime scene investigators. By sunset, the Oregon State Police had taken over the site entirely, cordoning off the area with tarps and floodlights as journalists began to gather just beyond the tree line. Rumors spread like wildfire. Someone said they'd found bones. Someone else said it was full of dolls. But the reality was quieter, more haunting. The bus was there. And it had been buried, intentionally. And thoroughly. It took 3 days of careful excavation to reveal the full shape of the vehicle. Bus number 54, last seen nearly 40 years earlier, lay on its side, its windows shattered inward, its tires long gone. Soil had settled into the chassis. Rust had eaten through much of the undercarriage, but it was unmistakably a school bus. The front end bore the familiar black numbering. The paint along the sides was mostly intact. And on the back, still legible under a thin film of dirt, were the words, "Emergency door." Inside, investigators worked slowly, documenting every inch. The door had been welded shut. The roof hatch had been sealed from the outside. Whatever had happened here, someone had gone to great lengths to keep it hidden. The seats were rotted, but still bolted to the floor. Backpacks, decayed and mold-covered, were strewn about the aisle. A child's shoe rested near the front wheel well. On the last row seat, a faded paper namatag clung to the vinyl LIJ. Scrawled in marker, there were no bodies, but the air inside the bus felt like something had died. Sheriff Dan Merton, now retired but never really gone from the case, stood just beyond the caution tape. He watched the recovery team's work, his hands in his pockets, jaw tight. It was the moment he both hoped for and dreaded. The kind of moment that doesn't come with relief, just more questions. After nearly 4 decades, bus number 54 had come back. And it hadn't been lost. It had been buried. Hidden, forgotten on purpose. Unearthing the bus took time. The ground around it was dense and packed with decades of sediment and root systems. Every shovelful had to be carefully examined, every move deliberate. It was no longer just construction, it was excavation, archaeology, forensic recovery. Beneath 5 feet of silence, bus number 54 had waited nearly 4 decades. And as more of it emerged, the story it had carried began to shift from tragic to terrifying. The windows were no longer transparent. Each pane had been painted over in black from the inside, thick brushstrokes visible even through the cracking decay of time. It wasn't dust or grime, it was intentional. Whoever buried the bus hadn't just wanted it hidden in the ground. They wanted it hidden from view completely, no eyes out, no eyes in. The door, normally opened with a simple latch from the inside, had been welded shut. A thick seam of corroded metal fused the folding mechanism into a single, unyielding line. There were no signs of an accident. No crumpled steel or shattered windshield. The bus had not crashed. It had been placed here, covered, entombed. Once the vehicle was fully cleared, state investigators brought in a mobile lab. A team of forensic analysts in full suits moved in, photographing every inch of the exterior before breaching the welded door. It took 2 hours and an industrial saw to get inside. What greeted them was not chaos, but a hollow, frozen moment. As if time had stopped the second the last child had stepped aboard, the rows of seats remained intact, their green vinyl cracked with age and pressure. Some were still upright, others tilted as if someone had leaned too hard on them and never got back up. Dust and mold clung to the ceiling in hanging tendrils. In the center aisle, a collection of objects lay scattered as though dropped mid-motion. A red plastic lunchbox, collapsed and rusted at the hinges. A damp, half-open spiral notebook with drawings still faintly visible. A handful of toys, matchbox cars, a Rubik's Cube, a stuffed animal discolored beyond recognition. All decayed, all hauntingly personal. What stood out most, however, was the absence. No skeletal remains. No bones, not a single trace of human tissue. The bus was empty, but the interior told its own story. Blood residue was found on the floor. Between the 4th and 5th rows, barely detectable but confirmed by chemical analysis. On one of the back windows beneath the black paint, small scratches etched into the glass spelled out letters, jagged and uneven. They read, "Still here." Further back on the last seat, an odd series of lines had been carved into the vinyl and frame. It took investigators a while to realize they were tally marks, groups of 5, arranged in 4 long rows. 73 in total. Days, maybe? Time kept? A record of something. Or someone. The discovery stunned everyone involved. The implications were immediate and disturbing. Whoever had been inside that bus hadn't died in a crash. They hadn't disappeared in the woods. They had stayed locked in, surrounded by blacked out windows, waiting in the dark, and then one day, they were no longer there. There were no signs of forced escape. No emergency exits breached. It was as if the bus had been sealed, occupied, and then abandoned from within. Or emptied by someone else. The horror wasn't in what was found. It was in what wasn't. No footprints, no remains. Just silence, as complete and deliberate as the weld that sealed the door. After 39 years, bus number 54 had returned to the world. But the children had not. The air inside the bus was stale and heavy, thick with the musk of rust, mildew, and time. After nearly 4 decades underground, the interior had become a time capsule of absence, a place where decay clung to every surface and silence had settled into the fabric of the vinyl seats like a second skin. Yet, despite the collapse of time and weather, the bus still held echoes of its passengers, small, heartbreaking remnants of 15 lives paused mid-motion. Each seat had its own story. On the left side near the front, a pink backpack sat wedged between 2 cushions, its straps stiff and fused with mold. Inside, forensic techs found a crushed granola bar still in its foil wrapper and a crumpled piece of notebook, paper covered in misspelled words and a drawing of a smiling sun. The ink had bled with moisture, but the handwriting remained childlike, innocent and untouched by what came next. 3 rows back on the right, a hardcover library book titled Birds of the Pacific Northwest was discovered lying face down across 2 seats. The due date, stamped October 24, 1986, gave it a kind of cruel irony. Just behind it, a faded denim jacket with a Shasta Grove elementary patch on the sleeve hung limply over the backrest, sleeves turned inward as if the child wearing it had simply disappeared from within. Near the rear of the bus, investigators uncovered a pile of notebooks, most damaged beyond recognition. One, however, was salvageable. Inside were several pages of childlike journal entries, lists of favorite animals, stick figure drawings, then a sudden shift to scribbled lines, increasingly chaotic and nonsensical. On the last legible page, someone had written in large, looping letters, "We hear them at night." No further context. No explanation. Just that single chilling line. But the most disturbing discovery came from beneath the last row of seats. Tucked partially under the rusted frame, a pair of metal handcuffs lay among the dirt and dust, one bracelet closed, the other open. They were standard issue law enforcement grade. Not the kind a child would play with. Investigators logged them immediately, running serial numbers through local and federal databases. So far, no match. The presence of the cuffs inside a school bus full of missing children raised dark possibilities, ones the original investigation had never even dared to consider. Nearby, A single child's shoe sat upright in the aisle. It was blue canvas. Size 3, the laces still knotted. There was no matching pair. Just one shoe, sitting as if its owner might return at any moment. It was found adjacent to what forensic analysts would later confirm as dried blood trace amounts, soaked deep into the floor, barely visible now, but unmistakable under chemical analysis. The blood wasn't isolated to a single area. Additional samples were found on the backs of 2 seats and on one of the metal support poles near the emergency exit. Preliminary DNA testing showed multiple contributors. None were identified in any existing database. The samples were too degraded for immediate comparison with surviving family members, but the implications were clear. Something violent had happened inside that bus. And yet, no bodies. No remains. Nothing to suggest where the children or their driver had gone. Only objects left like breadcrumbs in a story missing its final chapter. Each artifact told a sliver of truth. Each raised 1,000 more questions. Who had brought the handcuffs? Why were the windows blacked out? What were the children hearing at night? And most terrifying of all, if they had been trapped, if they had suffered, if they had died, why? Was there no one left inside? Whatever had happened in that sealed tomb, it had been hidden too well, too long. The bus had finally returned from the earth, but the answers were still buried deeper. On the 4th day of the forensic sweep, after the cameras had moved on and the national headlines began to drift elsewhere, investigators made a discovery that would pull the mystery of bus number 54 back into sharp, unsettling focus. A crime scene. Technician, working near the rear driver's side seats, crouched low with a flashlight to document structural corrosion. The floor beneath the last row had been stripped back to bare metal, the rubber matting long since disintegrated. And there, etched crudely into the oxidized steel, partially obscured by rust and years of dirt, was a message carved by a trembling hand. The first thing they noticed were the initials. 4 sets, spaced roughly an inch apart, EJKMSD and LB. A quick cross-reference with the list of missing students confirmed what many feared. Each set matched the name of a child on the manifest. Eli Jensen, Kira Marino, Sean Darby, Lillian Booker. All 8 years old at the time of the disappearance. All presumed lost. Beneath the initials was a jagged outline scratched into the metal. It took time for the forensic team to interpret. But eventually they realized it wasn't abstract. It was a crude map. Uneven, childlike, but deliberate. A square marked B was connected by a series of lines to what appeared to be a larger oval marked with a cross. Another, off to the side, was simply labeled door. There were no geographic names, no directional indicators, just shapes and guesses, as though someone had tried to preserve the memory of a place with whatever limited means they had at. The far edge of the carving, in shaky letters that pressed unevenly into the rust, was a date, 10.24.86. 7 days after the disappearance. The implications were immediate. Someone, possibly multiple children, had still been alive 1 full week after the bus was last seen. Not just alive, but lucid enough to mark time, organize names, and recall layout. That alone dismantled the long-standing assumption that whatever had happened occurred quickly, perhaps even before help could have arrived. Instead, the etching suggested something prolonged, sustained, a slow unraveling of time in the dark. Experts examined the metal with specialized tools, confirming the scratches were old, consistent with 1986, and showed signs of being made under difficult conditions. The lines were uneven, hesitating, some repeated as if the hand had trembled. There were blood traces along the edge of the seat frame, suggesting the child or children had cut themselves while working. It raised terrible, impossible questions. Where had they been during that week? Inside the bus, sealed in? Somewhere nearby, kept alive in secret? Had someone been returning to the site, bringing supplies, monitoring them? Was the map a desperate attempt to remember the way out of wherever they'd been taken? Sheriff Merton, brought back into the fold as a consultant, stood over the etching for a long time that night. He didn't speak for several minutes. Then he asked a quiet question that no one wanted to answer. If they were alive on the 24th, who kept them alive? The team photographed the etching in detail, then carefully removed the entire floor panel for preservation. It would be analyzed, studied, and compared against every known landmark and outbuilding within a 10-mile radius. But the deeper truth was harder to face. Someone had survived the first week, maybe longer, and they'd tried to leave a trail, not a call for help, but a record. Not a scream, but a whisper, scratched into metal and left behind like a ghost's signature. A silent plea from the dark, saying, "We were here. We tried, remember us." The discovery of the tunnel came almost by accident. As the forensic team continued clearing the soil beneath and around bus number 54, a section of earth near the rear axle gave way, revealing a hollow space beneath the packed clay. At first, they thought it might be a root cavity or an animal den, but as they cleared further, the shape took on deliberate lines, flat walls reinforced with old timber, a narrow entrance carved with unsettling precision. It was no accident of nature. Someone had dug it. The tunnel ran directly beneath the rear half of the bus, as though the vehicle had been placed above it like a lid. When investigators crouched down and shone flashlights inside, they saw a descending passage that stretched roughly 30 feet into the hillside. The air seeping out was stale, a mixture of earth and something sour, a scent that seemed older than time. It took hours of stabilization work to ensure the space wouldn't collapse before a team could safely enter. What they found inside pushed the case into even darker territory. The passage opened into a bunker-like chamber, about 20 feet wide and 10 feet deep, its walls crudely reinforced with plywood and sheets of corrugated metal. Along the walls, there were makeshift beds, thin mats of foam, scraps of blanket, old military sleeping bags, all discolored and brittle with age. In one corner, a stack of rusted tin cans and glass jars was piled next to a camp stove. Someone had lived here, not for a night or two. For weeks, maybe longer. The evidence of habitation was both fascinating and horrifying. A water jug, capped but bone dry. A row of school lunchboxes, some dented, all faded with time, lined up neatly as though someone had organized them. A cracked enamel basin filled with the remnants of something black and unidentifiable. And scattered across the floor, drawings, children's drawings scratched into cardboard, etched on wooden scraps, some made with pencil, others in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Stick figures standing next to trees. A school bus with its windows blacked out. And always the same image repeated in various forms. A door, drawn in thick, dark strokes, sometimes standing open, sometimes with something looming behind it. The most chilling find, however, was a small notebook tucked beneath one of the sleeping mats. Its pages were water damaged, but much of the writing remained legible. The handwriting was uneven, but distinctly childlike, full of misspellings and fragmented sentences. Investigators believe it belonged to one of the children, likely 9-year-old Kira Marino, based on the initials scrawled on the inside cover. The journal was not a story, it was a record. The early entries were hopeful, almost confused. "We are waiting for Henry to come back. We think they forgot us. We are okay, but hungry." As the pages went on, the tone shifted. "It is always night in here. We hear footsteps." On top, Eli says we have to be quiet or they come. The final entries were nearly illegible, the pencil strokes shaky and frantic. The very last page contained only 3 words, scrawled so hard that the pencil tip had torn through the paper. "Don't open door." Forensic analysis confirmed that the chamber had been occupied during the period following the bus's disappearance. Soil composition, decayed food remnants, and the wear patterns on the bedding suggested prolonged captivity. But the question that hung over everyone like a shadow that wouldn't move was who had kept them there. The bus driver? An unknown abductor? Someone connected to the land itself? The discovery of the underground bunker didn't solve anything. It only made the mystery more unbearable. It confirmed what the etching on the bus floor had already implied. The children had survived, at least for a time, in conditions no one could have imagined. And someone somewhere had made sure no one found them. As the scope of the investigation widened, the question shifted from what had happened to why, and more disturbingly, who had made it happen. The idea that 15 children and their bus driver had vanished by accident no longer held any weight. The evidence was too deliberate, too methodical. The blacked-out windows, the welded door, the sealed tunnel. The bunker stocked with food and bedding. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide not only the victims, but the very fact that they had been held at all. It wasn't a disappearance anymore. It was a conspiracy. And someone had buried the truth, literally and figuratively. Investigators began working backward, compiling a list of names people who had lived near the site in 1986, property owners, forest workers, seasonal rangers. Some were easy to find. Others had long since died or moved out of state. Among the first to draw serious scrutiny was Wallace Dreer, a reclusive landowner whose property had once bordered the Pine Barrens to the south. Dreer had been known in the community for his fierce anti-government rhetoric and regular clashes with county officials over zoning and trespassing laws. In 1985, he had been arrested for illegally constructing underground bunkers on his property, citing civil defense preparedness. He paid a fine and disappeared from public view shortly after. By the time the bus was discovered, Dreer had been dead for nearly 10 years. Then there were the files from the school district itself, boxes of personnel records, transportation logs, and communications dating back to the early 1980s. While most of the paperwork was routine, one memo stood out, a confidential internal report from 1984, marked sensitive, regarding concerns over bus route deviations by Henry Garrison. According to the memo, a teacher had reported seeing Garrison stop the bus at unlisted locations on at least 2 occasions, both in rural areas with no student pickup scheduled. No disciplinary action had been taken. The report was never followed. Former staff were interviewed, including administrators, teachers, and school board members who had since retired or relocated. Many claimed not to remember anything unusual. Some seemed visibly uncomfortable discussing the case. One former board member, interviewed anonymously, said there had been rumors at the time quiet talk of militia activity in the Pine Barrens, of secret meetings and armed camps hidden deeper in the woods. No one wanted to say it out loud, he said, but there were people out there in those woods who didn't want to be found, and they didn't take kindly to strangers, especially kids asking questions. Local historians confirmed that several paramilitary groups had operated in the region during the early 1980s, fueled by Cold War paranoia, survivalist ideology, and deep distrust of federal authority. Some of these groups were short-lived. Others, according to unconfirmed reports, had built extensive underground networks, including bunkers not unlike the one discovered beneath the bus. The theory began to take shape that the children may have stumbled into something, seen something they weren't supposed to. That their disappearance had been a containment. But containment for what? No group ever claimed responsibility. No manifesto surfaced, no ransom note, no demands. Just the silence of a buried vehicle and a story no one had dared to finish telling. The idea that the bus had been taken by force, hidden, and the children kept alive, if only briefly, spoke to an operation far more organized than a lone predator or a random act of violence. It suggested complicity, planning, a system designed not just to abduct, but to erase, and someone had helped it stay erased. whether it was local officials turning a blind eye, frightened neighbors unwilling to speak up, or something more coordinated. And sinister, the reality was this: bus number 54 hadn't simply gone missing. It had been buried, along with the truth. And now that it had surfaced, the people responsible were still out there, some in graves, others possibly watching the news, with tired eyes, waiting to see just how much the world was finally willing to uncover. The return of bus number 54 did more than revive an old mystery. It shattered whatever fragile peace Shasta Grove had managed to build in the decades since the children vanished. The moment news broke that the bus had been unearthed, that evidence of captivity had been found beneath it, the town shifted. Conversations grew quieter. Curtains stayed drawn. A sense of unease threaded through the community like smoke in a sealed room. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was fear. Fear that the answers were closer than anyone wanted to admit, and that someone in town had always known more than they let on. Some residents spoke openly, as if relieved that the silence was finally cracking. Carol Finney, whose brother Sean had been among the 15, stood in front of a camera with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands, recounting how their parents had never truly recovered. "My mother used to say she had dreams where Sean called out from underground," she said. "We thought it was just grief. But now ... maybe she wasn't dreaming." Her voice broke on the last word. She didn't finish the interview. Others were less willing to talk. When reporters visited the homes of former school officials, retired bus drivers, and landowners with ties to the area near the Pine Barrens, they were often met with closed doors or polite refusals. Some said they didn't remember the details. Others simply muttered, "Let the dead rest," before turning away. In a town where everyone once knew everyone else's business, the sudden rush of amnesia rang hollow. Then there were those who seemed genuinely shaken. People who came forward not with new facts, but with long-held suspicions they had kept, buried out of fear or shame. One elderly man, who asked not to be named, confessed that back in the fall of 1986, he had seen two men loading something large and tarp-covered into a flatbed truck near a remote service road bordering the Pine Barrens. He hadn't come forward at the time. "You didn't ask questions in those days," he said, "especially not about men with guns in the woods." When pressed, he admitted he hadn't even told his wife, a former teacher, retired and now living in Bend, recalled a peculiar staff meeting that took place a week after the disappearance. "They told us not to speculate publicly, not to talk to reporters," she said. But it was more than that. It was a warning in all but name. "We were told that things were being handled at the appropriate level." That phrase stuck with me. What began to emerge was a portrait of a town that had been carefully steered away from asking too many questions. Whether out of fear, complicity, or simple fatigue, a kind of collective silence had descended after the bus disappeared. And now, with the truth clawing its way back to the surface, that silence had become unbearable. Local authorities insisted there had never been a cover-up, only a failed investigation and a tragedy that grew colder with time. But the timeline, the missing documents, the ignored leads, it all began to feel like too much coincidence. People started wondering why, for instance, the original ranger photos had been misplaced. Why known militia activity hadn't been publicly acknowledged. Why the school's internal report on Garrison had been buried in a personnel file instead of turned over to investigators. In every church service, grocery line, and quiet dinner conversation, one question began to rise above the rest. Who had been protecting what? The answers, if they existed, weren't coming quickly, and many feared they never would. But one thing had become clear: Shasta Grove was no longer just a town with a tragedy in its past. It was a town haunted by silence. And now that the silence had cracked, it wasn't grief pouring out, it was suspicion. The kind that changes everything. The kind that doesn't let go. The recovery of bus number 54 was supposed to bring answers, closure, resolution for families who had spent nearly 4 decades trapped in limbo, for a town that had learned to live with a hole in its history. But as investigators packed up the site, as experts cataloged every artifact, and as journalists wrapped their stories with solemn headlines, one truth remained impossible to ignore. The biggest questions were still unanswered. Where were the bodies? 15 children, 1 adult, a sealed bus, a hidden bunker. Yet no remains, no bones, no definitive proof of death. Just the artifacts, the backpacks, the blood, the crude drawings, the desperate scratches into rusted steel. Signs of life and signs of suffering, but no one left to speak for it. The absence was deafening. Investigators scoured the surrounding forest, brought in cadaver dogs, used ground-penetrating radar to probe the hillsides. Nothing, not even a tooth. It was as if they had been lifted out of the world, or scattered so effectively that nature itself had swallowed them whole. Who orchestrated it? The question hung over every analysis like smoke. This wasn't the work of a disoriented driver or a moment of madness. Someone had planned it. The bunker didn't dig itself. The food didn't stock itself. The windows didn't black themselves out. There was deliberation behind every detail, control, preparation. But for what purpose? If it was an abduction, why no ransom? If it was punishment, why the secrecy? If it was madness, how had it stayed hidden for so long, so completely? Theories multiplied. Some whispered of cults, others of paramilitary groups gone rogue. Still others suggested a government experiment, a black ops psychological study lost to bureaucracy and buried beneath layers of plausible deniability. But without names, without evidence, they remained what they had always been: stories. Fictions growing in the soil of absence. Why did no one come forward? This, perhaps, was the most painful question of all. Someone had to have known. Not just those who planned it, but those who saw something, heard something, felt something was wrong, and chose silence. Maybe they were afraid. Maybe they were complicit. Maybe they just couldn't face the truth. The passage of time while healing on the surface had also protected the guilty and blurred the details. The longer the silence endured, the more it became part of the fabric of Shasta Grove. By the time the truth clawed its way back into the light, too many of the people who might have answered for it were dead, disappeared, or unwilling to speak. And so the mystery remains. There's the bus, now housed in a secure facility. Its corroded skeleton, a monument to something too large and too horrible to name. There's the journal, the map, the etchings, all signs of life, all traces of a final chapter never written. There are the families, still waking each morning with questions echoing in the corners of their homes. There is a town still afraid of what its own soil might yet reveal. Some mysteries refuse to close. Some truths are too deeply buried. And in the forgotten forests of America, where trees whisper and shadows stretch longer than memory, not every story ends with justice. Questions that remain are not just for law enforcement. They belong to all of us. How does a bus vanish? How does a town look away? And how do you mourn a grave that was never filled? The truth may still be out there, or it may have died with the ones who buried it, but the wind still moves through the pine barrens, and somewhere, deep beneath the hush of branches, the silence waits.